right, today we have chapter 6 of Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. This is the never want to go to bedders cure. Each evening as the clock struck 8, Mrs. Gray called Bobby and Larry and Susan, and she said, "Come children, 8 o'clock, time for bed." She tried to make her voice sound cheerful and happy, but usually she felt like groaning because she knew what was coming. First Susan, "Oh, we don't want to go to bed now. Please let us stay up a little while longer. Please, Mother, please." And then Bobby, "We are the only ones in our whole neighborhood who have to go to bed at 8 o'clock. Then Larry, "Mother, nobody, not anybody at all goes to bed at 8 o'clock. Then Susan again, "But Mother, we have only just started this game." And then Bobby, "Please let us finish this game, please." And then Larry, "Just one more turn, Mother. It's my turn, Mother, and I haven't won a game this evening. Please." Mrs. Gray said, "Now, Bobby, Larry, and Susan, you know that if you want to grow up to be fine young men and women, you must have plenty of sleep. I'm sure they teach you that in school." "We don't want to grow up. We just want to finish this game," Bobby wailed. And so night after night, poor Mrs. Gray argued and pleaded and begged her children to go to bed. And by the time they had finished whining and complaining, it was usually almost 9 o'clock, and Mrs. Gray was desperate. Finally, one day she called her friend Mrs. Grassfeather and said, "Hello, Mrs. Grassfeather, this is Mrs. Gray, and I would like to find out what time Catherine and Wilfred go to bed." Mrs. Grassfeather said, "Why, at 8 o'clock, Mrs. Gray, unless their Uncle Jasper comes for dinner, and then I usually let them stay up until 9:30 to hear Uncle Jasper tell about his experiences in the Boer War." That, of course, is strictly Mr. Grassfeather's idea, and not only allows the children to stay up until 9:30, but he pays them as well for listening to Uncle Jasper while he goes to bed. Mrs. Gray said, "Do the children like to go to bed at 8 o'clock?" And Mrs. Grassfeather said, "Oh, they are very good about it because they know that if they whine and complain, I will not let them stay up the next time Uncle Jasper comes over, which is about 4 nights a week." As the Grays had no Uncle Jasper, Mrs. Gray realized that Mrs. Grassfeather could be of no help, and she said goodbye and hung up the phone. Then she called Mrs. Gardenfield. "Hello, Mrs. Gardenfield, this is Mrs. Gray, and I called to see what time Worthington and Guinevere go to bed at night." Mrs. Gardenfield said, "Oh, they go to bed any time after Daddy comes home. You see, Mrs. Gray and Mr. Gardenfield gets home at 4:30, and we have dinner at 5:30, and the children, like Mr. Gardenfield and I, go to bed at 6:30. 6:30, said Mrs. Gray, amazed. "My goodness, that is early." And Mrs. Gardenfield said, "It's not early if you get up at 4:30. And Mrs. Gray said, "But who wants to get up at 4:30? "We do," said Mrs. Gardenfield, and she hung up the phone in a huff. So Mrs. Gray thought, and suddenly she remembered that only yesterday Dick Thompson's mother had been telling her about the wonderful little woman named Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. And so, even though she had never seen Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, she decided to call her on the telephone and ask her to help with the never want to go to bedders. She said to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "I am Mrs. Gray, the mother of Bobby, Larry, and Susan." And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, yes, of course. How are the children? I have not seen them since they returned from camp." Mrs. Gray said, "Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, Bobby, Larry, and Susan are very well and very cooperative until about 8 o'clock at night, when they turn into whiny, complaining little non-cooperators." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, yes, I see. They are the never want to go to bedders, aren't they?" And Mrs. Gray said, "How on earth did you know?" Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle laughed and said, "Oh, that is one of the commonest of children's ailments. The moment you said they were good until 8 o'clock, I knew what the trouble was." Mrs. Gray said, "Do you know anything I can do for them? How to cure this hateful disease?" And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, that's very simple. Beginning tonight, don't tell them to go to bed. Let them stay up as late as they want to. And you and Mr. Gray go on to bed any time you are tired, but leave the children downstairs." And Mrs. Gray said, "But their health, That will ruin their health. And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, I do not believe that a day or so without sleep will harm them, and it will certainly cure them. It's really worth a try, Mrs. Gray, but if you have any trouble and the cure doesn't seem to be working, call me." Mrs. Gray said, "Oh, thank you very much, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. I will let you know tomorrow how we are getting along." That night at 8 o'clock, the clock struck, and Mrs. Gray continued to mend socks and said nothing about bed, and Mr. Gray changed the radio, and Bobby, Larry, and Susan played Parcheesi. At 9 o'clock, the clock struck again, and Mrs. Gray put down the socks and took up a woman's magazine. Mr. Gray changed the radio, and Bobby, Larry, and Susan continued to play Parcheesi. When 10 o'clock struck, Mrs. Gray yawned and put down the magazine, and Mr. Gray snapped off the radio, and Larry, Susan, and Bobby began another game of Parcheesi. At 10:30, Mr. and Mrs. Gray went upstairs to bed and left the children playing Parcheesi. At 12 o'clock, Mrs. Gray awoke and at first thought there were burglars in the house. And then she, excuse me. And then she remembered the never want to go to bedders. And so she tiptoed down the stairs. And there were Bobby and Larry and Susan playing Parcheesi on the living room rug. And there is a picture of them still playing. Whoa, too much reading. Oh. The next morning, the children slept till 11:30. About 9 o'clock, Dick Thompson's mother stopped by to take them to the beach. But Mrs. Gray told her that they were still asleep. Oh, they missed out on the beach. When the children finally got up, they were cross and quarrelsome. When their mother told them about Mrs. Thompson inviting them to the beach, and they said, "Why didn't you wait for us? Why didn't you wake us up?" "I think Mrs. Thompson's mean not to wait." Boy, I'm sorry. I don't think Mrs. Thompson was mean. She can't wait all day for sleepy kids. Mrs. Gray said, "I see no reason why Mrs. Thompson and Dick should have their day spoiled waiting for the 3 little members of the all-night Parcheesi Club to get up. Now come and eat your breakfast and stop complaining." That night after dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Gray went to a moving picture show and left Larry, Bobby, and Susan playing Tiddlywinks. When the Grays came home about 12:30, the children were still up playing Tiddlywinks and quarreling about whose turn it was. The next morning, they had a 9 o'clock dentist appointment, and so Mrs. Gray got them up at 8. Susan was so sleepy she could not eat her mush, and Larry yawned so much that he choked on his egg and had to be turned upside down and shaken by his legs. Bobby just sat and rubbed his eyes. Bobby went to sleep in the car on the way to the dentist, and Susan went to sleep in the dentist's waiting room, and Larry slept all the way home. That night, after their parents had gone to bed, Larry said, "Why do we have to stay in the house all the time? Let's go outside and play." So they went outside, and they put on their roller skates, and they began skating up and down the dark streets. Mrs. Milgram, who lived on the corner, came out of her front porch in her bathrobe and yelled, "For heaven's sakes! Don't you children know that it's almost midnight? What on earth are you doing up at this hour?" And Larry said, "We don't have to go to bed anymore. We just stay up late every night." And Mrs. Milgram said, "Well, stay up late someplace else and be quiet." And she went into her house and slammed the door. So the children took off their skates and tiptoed back to the house, and they got out the Parcheesi board. But Susan said it was her turn for the pinks, and Larry said, "I happen to beg your pardon, but it's my turn." And Susan said, "You had the pinks yesterday, and Bobby had them the day before, so it's my turn tonight." And she began to cry. Larry threw the pinks at her, and one of them went into the fireplace, and they had to strain the ashes through their fingers until they found it. And when they were finally ready to play, Bobby was asleep with his head on the board. So Susan and Larry played, jumping their men across Bobby's head, until Susan, too, fell asleep right in the middle of her turn. Larry woke Susan and Bobby, and they all went up to bed just as the clock struck 1. The next day, there was a matinee at the neighborhood theater, and Mrs. Gray said they could go. It was a wonderful picture with Indians and cowboys and pioneers, and the children were very excited. But no sooner had they found their seats and settled back in the nice dark theater when first Susan, then Bobby, and finally Larry fell asleep. They slept peacefully through the Indian picture, a Mickey Mouse cartoon, and a newsreel. And when the show was over, all the other children went home to dinner, but Larry and Susie and Bobby slept on. Susan was the first to awake. She sat up and rubbed her eyes. Where was she? Why was it dark? Oh, how stiff and cramped she was. She poked Larry and Bobby until they awoke. They were frightened when they realized that they were still in the theater, now dark and empty, except for 2 rats nibbling on popcorn in the front row. Susan began to cry. Everybody's gone and left us, and we'll have to stay in here until we die, she cried. And Larry said, oh, Susan, don't be silly. All we have to do is walk out the door. Come on, everybody. And they groped their way up the aisle to the door, but it was locked. And they tried all the doors, but they were all locked. And Susan began to cry. I'm hungry and I want to go home, she wailed. Bobby said, it'll be better. I'll bet there's a way back. I bet there's a back way, Larry. Let's look. And they felt their way back and down the aisle again and climbed up on the stage. And then suddenly they heard the front door open and a flashlight's bold eye blinded them in the darkness. And a voice said, hey, what's going on in here? What are you kids doing? It was Mr. Murphy, the janitor. And the children were so glad to see him that they ran and clung to his legs and all talked at once. Oh, Mr. Murphy, we were locked in. We must have fallen asleep in the picture. What time is it? Will you let us out? Mr. Murphy laughed at them and let them out the front door and drove them home. Mother and Daddy were in the living room playing bridge and the Andersons and seemed not at all surprised to see the children. Mrs. Gray said, there's bread and milk on the kitchen table. Please put everything away when you finish. And they went on with their game. The children ambled out to the kitchen, but they were too tired to eat, so they went upstairs and flung themselves across their beds. After they had rested for a while, Larry suggested they play burglar. And they turned off all the upstairs lights and crept around behind doors and under beds and had a fine, scary time until Larry pushed Bobby down the clothes chute and Bobby stuck and Susan screamed and Daddy came upstairs and yanked Bobby out, spanked them all, and sent them all to their rooms. Susan and Bobby got right into bed and went to sleep, but Larry stayed awake until the guests had gone home and their mother and Daddy had gone to bed. And then he pinched Bobby awake, and they both sneaked into Susan's room and pulled off her covers. And Larry said, let's go downstairs and see if there are any sandwiches or cookies left. And Susan was very sleepy, but she said, oh, all right. They ate about 10 little sandwiches, a small dish of salted nuts, 2 little dishes of candy, some olives, some pickles, and some chocolate marshmallow cake. They felt very lively after that, so they sat down at the bridge table and began playing slapjack. And when they finished the last game, the birds were singing, and they heard the thump of the morning paper on the porch, and they scurried up to bed quickly. The next day was Patsy's birthday, and it was a wonderful party with a fish pond and a magician who did tricks and games and balloons and prizes for every child. But Larry, Bobby, and Susan did not enjoy it at all. Susan had such big black circles under her eyes that Patsy's mother thought she was sick and would not let her have any refreshments. Bobby was so sleepy he fell asleep just as the magician pulled a rabbit from under his chair. And the magician thought Bobby was so rude that he gave the rabbit to Herbert Prentice. Larry fell asleep right at the table, and he laid his cheek in the ice cream, closed his eyes, and dreamed he was at the North Pole. Patsy's mother called all the others to look at him, and when he awoke, he was very embarrassed. That night, when 8 o'clock came and Mr. and Mrs. Gray were working on the budget and not saying much, and Susan and Larry and Bobby were sitting on the Davenport pinching each other to keep awake. At last, the clock struck. Bong, 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 bong. The children jumped and rushed over to their mother and father, and they said, it's 8 o'clock, time for bed. Please let us go to bed. We don't want to stay up anymore. Please. Mrs. Gray said, well, I thought you enjoyed staying up late. I thought all the children in the neighborhood stayed up late. The children said, "Nobody has to stay up late but us. We just hate it. May we go to bed, please?" And Mrs. Gray said, "Very well, children. From now on, if you are good, I will let you go to bed at 8 o'clock every night." And that is the end of chapter 6, the Don't Go to Bedders Cure. Next is chapter 7, the Slow Eater Tiny Bite Taker Cure.